Hello, everyone. Allow me to warmly welcome you to today's seminar session, the second of the seminar series called Curriculum Studies in Canada. My name is Ying Ma. I'm the UBC Postdoctorate Fellow and coordinator for this seminar series. I feel very happy to chair today's meeting. Each session will be approximately 1 hour with speakers allotted around 40 minutes to give their presentations, followed by a short Q&A segment. With the permission of the speakers, we'll be recording each session and they will become available on both of our website, curriculumstudiesincanada.ca, and our YouTube channel. And now I want to welcome Lee to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jan Gilbert from York University. Welcome.
Hello. So I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this morning, Dr. Jan Gilbert. Dr. Gilbert is an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at York University in Toronto. Her work draws together queer theory, curriculum studies, and psychoanalytic theories of teaching and learning to explore the relationship between sexuality and education. She's the author of the monograph, Sexuality in School, The Limits of Education, which won the AERA Division B Outstanding Book Award. She's also recently co-edited with Dr. Sharon Lamb, the Cambridge Handbook of Sexual Development, Childhood, and Adolescence. In addition, she's recently co-edited special issues of the journals Sex Education and Teaching Education on the topics of trans youth in education and LGBTQ+ teachers, respectively. In recent years, Dr. Gilbert has collaborated with colleagues at Teachers College and San Francisco State University on the Beyond Bullying Project, which is a multi-site ethnography and storytelling initiative that invited students and teachers in 3 US schools to tell stories about LGBTQ sexuality and gender. That research, now published in the Harvard Educational Review and elsewhere, works to shift the narrative about LGBTQ sexuality and young people in schools. Dr. Gilbert and colleagues show that students and teachers come to school with rich, diverse, and often ordinary relationships to queerness and to queer and trans people. Teachers and students might have queer or trans family members or live in a historically gay neighborhood or be grappling with what it means to be a good friend to their queer and trans peers. Through this research, Dr. Gilbert and colleagues argue that these ordinary stories about LGBTQ sexuality are obscured by the narrow focus on bullying that dominates the scholarly literature and popular discourse about LGBTQ young people. They insist that we move beyond bullying and towards a more expansive understanding of the intimate possibilities available to young people in schools. Dr. Gilbert has recently begun a new research project on discourses of consent in sex education, which investigates how contemporary sex education policy reflects, furthers, or challenges ideas about youth and sexual agency. Across her research, Dr. Gilbert is attuned to the messiness, complexity, difficulties, and joys attendant to the work of growing up and going to school. Dr. Gilbert challenges the impulse of schools and policymakers to treat sexuality as if it could be contained in the sex education classroom or the Gay-Straight Alliance, showing instead how sexuality animates all of our educational endeavors. Her work reminds the fields of curriculum studies and sexuality education of the pedagogical importance of ambiguity, uncertainty, and desire. In her talk today, titled Between Expertise and Advocacy, Sex Education and the Problem of Curriculum, Dr. Gilbert revisits her experience serving as an expert witness to the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal in support of a transgender sixth grader who sought to sue the province for revoking a progressive sex education curriculum. In her paper, Dr. Gilbert delves into several important tensions between the curriculum governments provide and the curriculum that is made and remade as it is lived in schools, and between being an expert on sex education and knowing enough to be suspicious of claims to expertise. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Gilbert.
Thank you, Lee. That was very generous and kind, and it's lovely to see you. Lee is an alum of York, and so now that they're out there at UBC, I feel like I don't get to see you very often, so it's lovely to see you. Thanks to Dr. Piner for inviting me to participate, and to Dr. Phelan. This is wonderful. I think I'm starting to get used to the Zoom thing now that many of you are probably spending a lot of time staring at screens, and I'm going to read my paper. I should have made slides, but I thought, I don't know how to illustrate this. So I'm just going to go through it, and I hope some of you will have questions, and if not, I'm always happy to receive emails with questions later on. So I'll just dive right in. Educational researchers are often called upon to bring our expertise and research to contexts outside the university. These contexts may lie slightly outside of our comfort zones. We may be interviewed by a journalist and asked to comment on a public issue. Perhaps a government agency solicits our participation in a policymaking process, or we might try and share our research with the communities that we research where we hope it might come to have an impact and improve the lives of young people, for instance. Funding bodies increasingly require researchers to plan for how their work is going to be disseminated to non-academic audiences. In Canada, we call this knowledge mobilization. In other places, they might call it knowledge translation, knowledge transfer. And as we meet all of these new conditions for engaged research, some of us, not me actually, may relish the role of public intellectual, while others reluctantly assume that position only when our research is particularly relevant. I study sex education, as Lee told you, and sex education, as you know, is regularly relevant. In Ontario here, we're in the midst of a constant crisis around sex education, and I know that's the case also in British Columbia. When something comes out, a new policy, a curriculum, journalists often contact me and ask me to comment on the relative merits of the changes, how they might affect teachers, students, and families. And even though I'm not totally comfortable with this, I am heartened when the media recognizes the expertise that universities can bring to the conversation. I don't think we should take this for granted. This feels especially important in education, since by virtue of having grown up in schools, everyone feels as though they are an expert on schools. So as I said, for the past 10 years, Ontario has been embroiled in a perennial sex education controversy, though it seems to have fallen by the wayside a little bit around COVID, though we can talk more about how COVID is actually radically changing the terrain of sex education in schools. When the controversy relates to the release of an updated and progressive elementary school sex education curriculum. It was released originally in 2010, and conservative organizations protested. The controversy then lasted years and became a major campaign issue across multiple elections. In 2018, Ontario elected a conservative government, in part because of that party's opposition to this progressive sex education. And upon taking office, one of the first actions the government took was to remove that updated curriculum and replace it with an old, antiquated 1998 curriculum. So throughout this time, I spoke with reporters, I did professional development with teachers and administrators, conducted a research study with colleagues on the effects of these controversies for teaching and learning. And in all this work, I tried to support teachers and parents who advocate for progressive, inclusive sex education for young people. I was eager to lend my voice to the curricular debates, even as I also recognized that my expertise was not always directly relevant to the questions that were at the fore. My research has been less concerned with curriculum development and more with understanding why sex education continues to rouse such strong feelings across different historical and political contexts. I've been interested in how sex education programs and policies become flashpoints for the contested relationships among youth, sexuality, and schooling. This interest allows me to sometimes stand at a distance from the question of whether a curriculum is good or bad, or even whether it's effective, and that those were certainly the questions that were at the fore during those controversies. So, in the fall of 2018, with Ontario schools struggling to figure out how to implement this outdated curriculum reintroduced by the Conservative government, I was contacted by some lawyers who asked if I'd be willing to serve as an expert witness. They were representing an 11-year-old trans girl known only as AB throughout the proceedings. And she was suing the government for removing this new progressive sex education. The invitation to act as an expert witness in the case called on me to bring my academic research into a different conversation, and with a different set of concerns. The lawyers asked me to draw on my experience studying the social, historical, and psychological context of controversies, and then to consider how AB's experience in school would be affected by the removal of that progressive curriculum. What effects would not learning about gender identity and sexual orientation in grade 6 have on AB and her peers? The challenge of participating as an expert witness went beyond translating my academic knowledge into the concrete language of causes and effects, harms and remedies that the legal system relies on. I also needed to rethink my relationship to the curriculum. What work could we, as teachers, students, parents, policymakers, researchers, what work could we expect the curriculum to perform? What knowledge would be represented in the curriculum and who would decide? What promises lay inside those curriculum expectations, learning objectives, and assessment strategies? These questions, ordinary to any discussion of curriculum and probably feel quite dull to you all, they take on a particular urgency in sex education, where the curriculum is freighted with contradictory demands. So the curriculum ought to be comprehensive, but still age appropriate. It must prepare students for healthy sexual lives, but not push them there too early. It should allow for many possible sexual and gender identities without being seen as endorsing, advocating, or recruiting students into queer and trans futures. So today, I want to follow these contradictions and impossibilities in a couple directions. First, I consider the call for academic researchers to mobilize our research toward particular ends. The pleasure of that call, the feelings of relevance, the desire to have our research make change in the context we study. As universities move our work toward the goal of social transformation, our expertise rests not only on our credentials and history of research, our racialized, sex, gendered, classed, and otherwise socially marked bodies can both confirm and undermine our standing as experts. As racialized women faculty in particular have insisted through their research, blogs, and biography, expertise is unevenly distributed. Racist and colonial assumptions about who counts as an expert bar certain bodies from being seen as knowing and knowledgeable. For sexuality studies scholars, and that's one of the ways I consider myself, the object of our study, sexuality, can also damage our claims to expertise. Using sociologist Janice Irvine's discussion of dirty work, I consider how individual faculty and the field itself tries to preserve our claim to expertise by cleaning up our research and shrouding sex in the language of outcomes, evidence, and health and well-being. This effort may be nowhere more apparent than in the sex education curriculum. In the controversies in Ontario, for instance, curriculum documents were held up as blueprints for teaching and learning. Conservative opponents regarded the updated curriculum as indoctrination into queer and trans lifestyles, while progressive advocates heralded the curriculum as protection against threats to students' health and well-being. Totally missing from public conversations, was an understanding of curriculum itself. How does the field of sex education understand the curriculum as it lives in classrooms? Can sex education curriculum be understood as something other than a blueprint or master plan? Here, I'm speaking to the converted here, but reconceptualist theories of curriculum obviously critique the idea that curriculum is a rationalist plan for teaching and therefore an inventory of student learning. Instead, curriculum is a relation made in the complex spaces between teacher, learner, and text, what Dr. Pinar calls a complicated conversation. Could the fantasy that curriculum determines learning be set aside to bring this expansive understanding of curriculum into debates about sex education? And if I were to talk of curriculum as a complicated conversation, would my expertise be of any use to AB and the progressive advocates supporting her claims? As I wrestled with these questions and the ways my intellectual commitments and research expertise might arrive in this case, I leaned on Wanda Pillo's question, quote, can researchers attend to injustices while simultaneously avoid assimilating witnessing into something familiar? That is, could I make common cause with AB and advocate for her right to an inclusive sex education without transforming myself, NAB, into something familiar. Okay, so a detour through the tribunal. So when so there I was, the fall of 2018, agreeing to serve as an expert witness before the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. The lawyers had contacted me because a colleague had referred them to me because of my expertise in sexuality education, as well as LGBTQ issues in schools. AB, this grade 6 trans girl, was living in a very small town in Ontario, and she wanted to take the government to court for revoking this sexual health curriculum that addressed sexual and gender diversity and replacing it with a curriculum that was literally systematically stripped of all explicit mention of gender and sexuality. The replacement curriculum that they inserted into this stripped down, so if you imagine the physical and health education curriculum, it has like phys ed, it has all sorts of health topics, and then it has a sexual development stream. That was the only one that was touched. And in that, they just kind of excised it and put in this 1998 curriculum that had a very anemic list of learning expectations and no queer content whatsoever. As public controversy swirled around this decision and progressive parents and advocates declared the government homophobic and transphobic, AB was living the consequences in her school. She worried she was missing crucial lessons about sexuality and gender, lessons that could help her make sense of her identity development as a trans girl. She was also concerned that her peers were not receiving the missing lessons about gender identity, and this may mean she would be newly and increasingly vulnerable to bullying and discrimination at school. The suit hinged on a double assertion. AB was harmed by the government's decision, and the government's decision put her in harm's way. This was the argument my expertise was called upon to support, and with the lawyer's guidance, I wrote a 20-page declaration that first established my expertise and then set out the reasons why, according to my own and others' research, I thought AB would be harmed. The experience of writing as an expert felt very weird. On the one hand, I do know a lot about sex education, more than the lawyers, more than the adjudicators or judges, and more than even AB herself. Studying sex education has been my life's work. On the other hand, to know a lot about sex education is to be suspicious of claims to expertise. Controversies about sex education are often contests between different panels of experts, all of whom claim to know what young people do and do not need to learn about sexuality and gender in schools. Studying these conflicts have made me suspicious of most declarations of certainty about sex education, and regularly the tone of authority that pervades much sex education curriculum policy covers over the unease and conflict that emerge when we talk about children, youth, and sexuality in schools. My uneasiness with the exercise emerged, at least in part, from the strategic deployment of my academic expertise. In my declaration, I had to make arguments that in other contexts I critique as heavy-handed or reject as too simplistic. So to give you an example, in my declaration, I wrote, "The applicant's school experience will be diminished by the removal of the mandatory lessons about gender identity in her grade 6 health curriculum. In the new old curriculum, she will no longer learn about the factors that influence a person's self-concept, including gender identity, nor will she receive lessons about stereotypes and challenging assumptions about gender roles and expression. She will not see herself in the description of development and puberty. In my professional view, the absence will offer other lessons, that her social, emotional, and health-related needs do not matter to her teachers, her peers, or society at large." I don't disagree with this statement. They are my professional views. But by arguing AB would suffer because she failed to receive these particular lessons on gender identity, I was claiming, without irony, a strong correlation between curriculum and learning outcomes, speculating even on causal relations. In my classes, I often tell students to be wary of assertions about the relation between teaching and learning. Just because we aim to teach something doesn't mean we can know what students learn from our instruction. Where was my faith in the educative potential of the complicated conversation among students, teachers, and texts? How could I assert in my declaration that the absence of this curriculum will harm AB, that without this curriculum, bullying will increase, self-esteem will be diminished, etc. And honestly, like if you think about AB, this kid living in small town Ontario, who all on her own decided to sue the government, she's probably fine, right? Like that is someone who has a healthy sense of self-concept. And yet at the same time, I am committed to advocating for AB and other queer, trans, and gender nonconforming young people. And I wanted to bring my analysis of how schools fail queer and trans students to the tribunal. So there I was the day of the hearing. I put all these reservations aside. I sat behind the microphone ready to answer questions and to say what I could to inventory the potential harms likely to fall AB. There were two adjudicators who are like the judges, and they oversaw the tribunal. Their task was to determine whether the government's decision violated AB's human rights as a trans girl. And in Ontario, discrimination on the basis of gender identity is prohibited by the provincial government. So as the hearing opened, one of the adjudicators welcomed me. Thank you, Dr. Gilbert, for joining us today. And then told the room, turned and said, we look forward to hearing from him. A moment of awkward silence followed. And then AB's lawyer, herself queer and gender nonconforming, corrected the adjudicator. Dr. Gilbert is a woman. Perhaps the gender neutral title of doctor, one marker of my expertise, created confusion, or was it my closely shorn hair? The adjudicator quickly apologized, but there I sat, a reminder of the problem the hearing sought to address. These categories are clunky and carry deeper psychic significance. Not only do I often feel still like a fraud, like my status as a doctor is precarious, I also feel ambivalent about pronouns and sit somewhat uncomfortably inside the designation woman. My awkwardness highlighted AB's struggles to be supported in her school. What if she were misgendered in class by a student or teacher, even unintentionally, and she did not have an advocate as I did in her lawyer to correct the mistake? We know these routine misrecognitions can be very painful for trans youth. What vulnerability must AB risk in the ordinary course of her school day? Could the progressive curriculum, with all of its limitations, speak to her vulnerability or provide some protection from discrimination, even if it could not guarantee such effects? So, sitting there in my pressed button-down shirt, I was left wondering how my non-normative gender expression established or undermined my expertise and my advocacy. Was I summoned to testify that as a gender non-conforming person, I know from experience that children and adults will make AB feel diminished because of her gender identity? Did that same shirt and haircut signal my bias and undermine my expertise? Did my gender expression make me too close, too interested, and therefore not only not an expert, but somehow contaminated by my gender and sexual non-normativity? Or did it incite on my behalf an unspoken and even unacknowledged claim to authority that the tribunal was also adjudicating? The discomfort these questions provoke lingered through 6 long hours of questioning. I tried my best to describe all the ways AB's experience of school would be adversely affected by the absence of the curriculum. You know, lots of statistics, other people's stats, my stats. You know, it was really a crazy, crazy day. I heralded the promise of curriculum to repair the wounds of an unjust social world. And at the end of those 6 hours, the adjudicators apologized for having misgendered me. It was sort of the closing of the day, thanked me for my time. And I left really unsure whether any of it had mattered. That evening, still buzzing from the events of the day, I came up with much better answers to the questions that had stumped me. And like the PhD student I once was, I wondered if I sounded smart enough, or whether my shirt was too butch, or whether I should have worn my fancier shoes. It turns out that when my expertise was mobilized for this tribunal, when my body was transported from the university lecture hall to this very drab hearing room in a downtown office tower, my feelings of being an expert also shifted. At the university, I expertly negotiate campus life as a white, queer, masculine professor, dodging confusion, asserting my authority when necessary, tolerating the missteps and mistakes of students and colleagues. But as it turns out, when I sat there in that hearing room, I totally lost my bearings. I felt vulnerable, exposed even, and the careful scaffolding that I've erected to prop up my expertise at the university suddenly felt shaky. The uncertainty I asked students to notice and value in their lessons returned to me as a threat. And perhaps like the beginning teachers I work with, or the graduate students I supervise who feel like imposters, I was terrified to say the wrong thing, sound stupid, or be accused of bias. These worries may be endemic to academic life, but they have a particular valence among sexuality scholars, and especially sexuality scholars who identify as LGBTQ. As Janice Irvine argues, these worries don't just affect how we as scholars experience academic life, they become installed in our knowledge practices. And Irvine sees these worries as evidence of dirty work. And I'm going to turn to that now. So sexuality scholars have long been preoccupied with how the field defines our object of research. Like just the question, what is the sexuality of sexuality studies? How do our theories and methods not only describe what we call sexuality, but how do those theories and methods invent sexuality as an object worthy of study, give it its shape, its force, its temporality? The question also moves in the other direction. How does sexuality then come to constitute the sexuality scholar? That is, how are we as researchers fashioned by the sexuality we study? How does it get inside of us, map the parameters of knowledge, influence our views of the world? Janice Irvine did this weird survey of sexuality scholars in her field, sociology, and out of this study, she describes sexuality studies research as dirty work, borrowing from the sociologist Everett Hughes. Dirty work is a term that he used to describe jobs everyone wants done, but no one wants to do. And crucially, in dirty work, the stigma of the occupation rubs off on the employee. So for Irvine, she sees sexuality studies as academic dirty work, and that the stigma of that of sexuality rubs off on the sexuality scholar. Contaminated by the stigma of sex, the sexuality researcher endeavors then to kind of clean up sexuality by embracing sanitary methodological or theoretical tools. In her study, Irvine follows all the ways that sexuality studies researchers bear what she calls the speaker's burden. So researchers domesticate the language of sex and funding applications. So we're not studying sexuality anymore, we're studying diversity. Or researchers, especially women, will deflect the unwanted sexual attention they receive from colleagues who assume that because they're studying sexuality, they must want to have sex with them. For those, a big topic of conversation among sexuality scholars is how to navigate ethics processes, because ethics boards assume that any talk about sexuality, especially with young people, is inherently risky. So at the tribunal, I was caught inside of this paradox that Irving describes. I was invited and recognized as an expert because of my research on sexuality, yet I was a little dodgy because I have devoted my academic career to studying sexuality. Irvine notes how LGBTQ researchers face additional scrutiny. Quote, identification with the research can be read as a lack of objectivity and marks the researcher as biased, trumping all other professional and social identities. We research, to borrow an old and now famous phrase from Eve Sedgwick, from an intimate position of survival and mourning. She wrote, I think everyone who does gay and lesbian studies, and now we might say queer and trans studies, is haunted by the suicides of adolescents. If we take Sedgwick at her word, the relationship between queer and trans adults and children is always marked by histories of homophobia and transphobia, violence and loss. We adults may have escaped our childhoods with our lives, but now our interest and our care for LGBTQ young people renders us suspect. Our research is dismissed as advocacy, and our interest in LGBTQ young people sits uncomfortably close to paranoid fantasies of recruitment and predation that stubbornly stick to queer and trans adults' relationships with young people, especially in education. These are the cruel paradoxes that Sedgwick hints inaugurate the discipline of gay and lesbian studies, that Irvine argues contaminate the work of sexuality studies researchers, and that I felt caught inside while speaking as an expert at AB's trial. Returning to the moment of misrecognition that kicked off my appearance at the tribunal when I was called sir or him, I suppose I ought to have felt slighted when the adjudicator called me him, but I didn't. It happens all the time. Part of my expert negotiation of campus and off-campus life involves anticipating these misrecognitions in bathrooms, cafes, hallways, even classrooms. And then, after being called sir or him, working to reassure the now uncomfortable speaker that I'm not offended. But always, whether it happens in a drugstore or in a tribunal, I feel embarrassed, as if I've introduced some friction into the smooth running of the social world that I am now also responsible for fixing. And so when the adjudicator called me him, I first worried that the adjudicator would be embarrassed by her mistake. And then in the split second that followed, I felt embarrassed for having caused her embarrassment. I offer this somewhat vulnerable account of my emotional response to that moment because it illustrates the dynamics at stake in this dirty work. The stain of sex that Irvine argues rubs off onto the researcher affects not only how sexuality researchers are regarded in the world and in their professional networks, but also how the researcher understands herself as a scholar. The sexuality researcher internalizes the stigma, surveils herself, tries to anticipate and deflect the offhand comment, and protects herself from unexpected rebukes. The effort is eased by my whiteness and the ways that that privilege aids my negotiation of professional spaces. In the tribunal too, I was able to deflect the error and reassure the adjudicator that no offense was taken. And yet, as much as I tried to clean myself up for that day in front of the tribunal, as easygoing as I tried to appear, I felt tainted. My masculinity made me vulnerable to charges of bias. My interest in the unintended lessons of sexuality and gender cast doubt on my assertions that a sex education curriculum can have knowable effects. And my academic training unsettled my confidence that I, any more than anyone, could be an expert on something as elusive as sexuality or gender. To be a queer researcher studying LGBTQ children and youth means trying to reconcile the sometimes competing pressures, to be an unwavering advocate for young people, while also holding on to the questions that threaten to undo the very categories of experience that advocacy may rely on. I'm going to jump ahead now to talk a little bit more about curriculum. At the center of sex education debates sits unexamined ideas, not only about sexuality and gender, but also about curriculum. So we can think of all sorts of ways sex education is actually, sex education controversies are actually about curriculum, even though they're not often framed that way. So, you know, what happens when primary school children read books about gay families during circle time? Or what effect will showing young people how to use a condom have on their sexual decision making? Or if children learn about gender identity in grade 3, will they become confused about their own gender? All of these questions concern the relationships among sexuality, gender, children, youth, and schooling, and they also contain largely implicit theories of curriculum. In sex education, we have treated the curriculum as a kind of like knowledge delivery system, and it's shocking compared to other curricular areas. We focus almost exclusively on what to include or exclude, the timing of the delivery, and the most efficient platform for that delivery. Our concerns are largely technocratic. You know, how can we get this information into those students? And, you know, because of the, you know, framed as sort of like a life and death, you know, problem. But there are other questions that we could ask in sex education, like, what ways might curriculum represent the actual and potential diversity among students and families? What protection can curriculum offer to students feeling lonely or left out? Or under what conditions might curriculum help students feel welcome and happy? What are the different ways we might describe the relationship between the curriculum delivered and the lessons received? So these are the kinds of questions that I hope sex education might begin to think about. But in the current debates, we're still operating in a very constrained logic. Conservatives They think that to talk about gender and sexual diversity, especially with children, exposes them to ideas that are not age appropriate, constitute a form of abuse, and could sway them into adopting false identities. In response, progressives invest heavily in the learning sciences, an approach that Peter Taubman critiques as steeped in discourses of neoliberalism. So there we adopt the progressive movement in sex education has adopted the language of standardization, of evidence, of empirical science. During the late 90s and early 2000s, when we were in another heightened moment around sex education controversies, progressive sex education really focused on how sex education could lower a number of poor health outcomes, and those were very dull. Delaying first intercourse, reducing the number of sexual partners, decreasing STI rates, increasing use of condoms during sexual intercourse, reducing unplanned pregnancies. In response, and now if we look at the debates around LGBTQ inclusive sex education, we find a similar strategy. So we need LGBTQ inclusive sex education because it's going to reduce a number of poor health outcomes for queer and trans youth, including reducing depression, improving academic performance, etc. And yet, if we look at the empirical evidence around what sex education curriculum can actually do, the effects of sex education on young people's sexual decision-making is very, very small. As Jonathan Zimmerman says in his study of global sex ed, scholars around the world have struggled in vain to show any significant effect of sex education upon youth sexual behavior. And yet, despite these failures, the language of evidence and empiricism has thoroughly saturated progressive sex ed. O'Quinn and Fields begin their critique of US national standards for sex education with the observation that evidence has replaced abstinence as the idea with foundational cultural authority in sexual education debates. It's no accident that we've turned to this idea of evidence, and it's really closely tied to ideas of health and well-being. So while we might, as a group, understand all sorts of other outcomes that a progressive sex education curriculum might aim for, like, I don't know, more pleasurable sexual experiences, an expanded vocabulary for talking about one's desires, an analysis of how sexuality is shaped by social inequalities, health and well-being, and the health curriculum name a safe ground that distances sex education from sexuality. It's an example of what Epstein and Mamo describe as the rise of healthism in discussions of sexuality. Sexuality has become tied to health because this connection sanitizes all courses of action related to sexual matters. It contains and cancels the stigma that attaches itself to sexuality. So in a way, sex education, once it's wrapped in this language of health, actually becomes a defense against sexuality. In the Ontario debates, we can see that this was at work. I have a little section here where if you looked at all the progressive advocates and media coverage, people would be invoking suicidal gay kids as the reason we needed an LGBTQ inclusive sex education. One advocate, for instance, said, if gay kids don't know it's okay to be gay, they are stressed, depressed, and that can destroy their relationship, and they're more likely to commit suicide. So somehow the sex education curriculum comes in and is meant to cure these problems that the curriculum actually invokes. As I argue with my colleagues in the Beyond Bullying Project, this damage-centered research operates even benevolently from a theory of change that establishes harm or injury in order to achieve reparation. It risks conflating LGBTQ identities, desires, and communities with depression, harassment, substance abuse, and even suicide. When LGBTQ youth are represented in these debates as at risk of poor health outcomes, then the curriculum becomes sutured to those concerns. And queer and trans students can only be recognized and affirmed through that logic. So the goal of the curriculum then becomes to improve their health and protect students' well-being. And then even in the Human Rights Tribunal, where the discourse of rights might offer a different space to consider AB's experience of schooling, the violation of her human rights was often framed as an attack on her health. For instance, throughout my declaration, I argued that the removal of the progressive curriculum would have a negative effect on her well-being. But well-being is really a nebulous term that refers to health. Epstein and Mamo note that health and its legitimizing function is often invoked as necessary for the protection of sexual rights. So the logic goes like this: AB has a right as a trans girl whose gender identity is protected to access an LGBTQ inclusive sexual health curriculum. And in order for her to be able to lead a healthy life, including make healthy decisions about her sexuality, her human rights must be recognized, so that there's a way in which those two things become collapsed. In public debates and in the tribunal, the sex education curriculum is invested with enormous power. It has the capacity to shape behaviors, prevent disease, and impart knowledge, the potential to affirm identities, promote belonging, protect against discrimination and harassment. The wish is that the curriculum, like a magical force field, would surround AB and other trans students as they move through the school and through the challenges of adolescence, attracting their friends, repelling the insults and everyday violence of their peers. But as appealing as this idealized version of curriculum may be, it obscures the more ferocious powers that young people have in school, their ability to unmake and remake whatever lessons we seek to offer them through the curriculum. We may need to offer young people the most comprehensive, inclusive sex education our political and social contexts allow, but we must notice the work young people do on the curriculum, taking up some lessons while rejecting others, exposing the hidden and not so hidden inequalities that structure sex education, finding significance in unlikely places, and giggling their ways through the moments of real insight. These moments are also part of the sex education curriculum, but the lessons don't neatly align with the official Ministry of Education documents. These moments stage a meeting between a curriculum as planned fantasy and an unruly curriculum as lived reality. In doing so, they come close to what Janet Miller calls a queer curriculum practice. Miller insists that our thinking about curriculum needs to link us to our own ambivalent desires. She writes, "A queer curriculum practice compels us to consider how we are implicated in our desires for and enactments of, as well as our fear and revulsions toward, those identities and practices that exceed the norm." That is, our investments in the sex education curriculum in that plan reveal our hopes and fears for young people. And these investments, this curriculum, return us to our own histories of desire and revulsion, the haunting that Sedgwick recognized as the source of adults' care for young people. When I began writing this paper, I felt a contradiction between my desire to stand with AB and to support her claim to a progressive LGBTQ inclusive sex ed, and then my academic commitment to understanding, teaching, and learning about sexuality is marked by uncertainty. What could it mean for me as a scholar and a queer adult to unequivocally take AB's side, even as I recognized how the sides of this case were dictated by a homophobic and transphobic structure that meant you were either for or against the inclusion of LGBT content in sex ed? Of course I'm for inclusion, but in taking that stand, where would my questions about the complications of curriculum go? In interviews with the media prior to being involved in the case, I called attention to the uncertainties introduced by the removal of the curriculum. In a radio interview, I speculated that even after the removal of this progressive curriculum, teachers might still offer lessons about gender identity and express skepticism that the government would ultimately remove the mention of sexual and gender identity in their new curriculum. The government lawyers also recognized my embrace of ambiguity as a liability for the case built on certainty. And during the tribunal, they took that radio interview and played the audio of it for the whole room, saying, and in effect saying that my insistence that we didn't really know everything that would happen in classrooms undermined my argument that AB would be hurt by the removal of the curriculum. This is another effect of the dirty work argument. How does the sexuality researcher, often unwittingly, come to craft their research questions so that their findings might offer the evidence that AB so depended upon in her suit? How do we actually change our research project in order that we would come up with the answers that AB needed in order to be successful? That is, how is the horizon of sexuality research shaped by what Jose Esteban Munoz calls the limited vista of here and now? If I truly value the force of uncertainty in learning, I need to learn to stay inside these questions and complications. Uncertainty is not only a quality of curriculum, it is also at the heart of research. To advocate for AB, I do not need to forget the complexity of bringing these topics and lessons inventoried in an official sex ed curriculum into the messy and complicated conversations of classroom life. Instead, I lean on Avery Gordon's advice here on how to make common cause with the worlds we study. She writes, making common cause means our encounters must strive to go beyond the fundamental alienation of turning social relations into just things we know, and toward reckoning with how we are in those stories, with how they change us, with our own ghosts. Doing so is not easy because, among other things, knowing ghosts often shows up not as professional success, but as failure. And on one level, my participation in the case ended in failure. AB lost. My expertise, no matter how secure, did not persuade, even though there are lots of reasons why the case was not successful. Making common cause with AB means that it's not enough to know the most about sex education. And as I sort through the experience of sitting there for those 6 hours and sitting here for the many months it's taken me to write this paper, I can see the ghosts that linger, most too painful to name here. We can, as sexuality scholars and as queer and trans adults, lean on just the things we know. Often those, quote, numbers and stories, as Stephen Russell names them, can work to shift public policy and curriculum. But ultimately, we must reckon with how our efforts to support queer and trans young people risk holding us apart, protecting us from ghosts that linger in the crevices of declarations, executive summaries, and the finding sections of academic articles. Thank you. All right, I need a drink of water. I'm happy to get people's reactions or thoughts or questions or nothing, whatever you feel like.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gilbert, for your
Great.
very insightful and intriguing speech. And right now, there are a few minutes left for comments or questions. You can unmute yourself when you raise a question or comment. Go ahead, Sonia.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Gilbert. It really, it was an inspiring paper as well as experience. There's a lot for me to reflect on. And as you're sharing the both tension within the lawsuit as well as negotiating professional identity as well as a researcher identity, I was wondering how it seems like a tough edge, right? So being able to advocate for something that is so close, while knowing that learning outcomes are such thing as that one can aim within a curriculum field. I wonder where might be some space on reflection and individual transformation. If those were some concepts you were thinking about, I wonder what was that internal conversation sounded like? Sorry about a very unarticulated question.
No, thank you for the question. So are you asking me how I thought about my own internal transformation in the
Correct.
midst of those? Okay.
Yes.
Oh, well, you know, I think that I think that when we study social inequality, we really want our research to reduce social inequality. And how do we know that's possible? How do we know that research can do that? You know, especially if we're going to ask a question in our research that we don't know the answer to. And I think that one of the things that this case really asked me to do was to think about what use my ideas about sex education might be to a grade 6 trans girl in middle school. What use would she have of my ideas about controversies in sex education? And I think that I thought that I had to be an expert in one particular way, you know, and when I started writing the paper and when I was working on my declaration, I in a sense felt like a PhD student again, because I felt I had to make myself up into this very empirical researcher who had the evidence that would show that this curriculum would have this kind of impact, and the absence of the curriculum would have this kind of impact. And I think that over the process of participating and then thinking about it, I have never before returned to the questions that I began my PhD journey with, around the uncertainty and ambivalence that sexuality introduces into curriculum. And what does it mean to have a curriculum built around something as elusive and unknowable and ultimately unintelligible as sexuality and gender? And what happens when we try to use Wanda Pillow's question, what happens when we try to transform sexuality and gender into something familiar in order that it could be represented in these particular discourses? And so I don't know if I have an individual transformation. It just was a very humbling experience, you know, and I felt really grateful to have been asked to participate and recognized, I guess, the limits of my own expertise much more than I thought I would. So that's a kind of messy answer, and it's in part because the paper is really, I'm really at the beginning of something, and so it feels sort of messy to me. But thanks for the question.
Thank you so much.
Should I answer Liam's question in the chat? Answer.
I thought I would just throw it out there instead of saying it. So
I like it. I mean, I think you're getting at that problem where if you're an expert, and I think that students, well, all of us who study communities that we also belong to feel quite implicated in, which is how do we tell the, you know, what is this fake value of neutrality, and what do we do when we're accused of like me search, or if there's some sense that our participation in a community makes us weirdly unqualified to research that community. And I don't know how we circumvent this belief. I see how it travels. I see how it affects students' understanding of themselves as researchers. I find one of the things that's really interesting to me is, and I don't know if you, I'm assuming some of your students, but I find it really interesting to think about how difficult it feels, how guilty I sometimes feel when I want to ask a question that goes beyond queer and trans youth, that doesn't have some immediate relevance to the quality of their life in schools, to ask a question that feels conceptual, you know, and that could be hard because it feels in a weird way selfish or something. And I think that Janice Irvine's idea of dirty work kind of gets at the ways in which we limit even the kinds of questions we ask because of our worry around stigma. And yeah, so I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's something I'm grappling with too. Thanks. Other thoughts or questions?
Thank you for your speech. I really enjoyed the speech. So I have a question regarding your talk. I originally come from China. So as I recall, the sexuality education I received in the middle school was limited to some basic knowledge of reproductive system covered by biology class. So in China or in Chinese culture, sexuality is kind of sensitive. So I'm really interested in what kind of role the dominant culture of a place or a country may play during the implementation of sexuality education in some kind of more detailed way. Yeah. Would you like to share some stories or cases regarding this?
Well, one of the things I would say is that it's important to think of sex education or sexuality education as much bigger than those lessons in the health class. That young people are learning about sexuality everywhere and throughout the school. And in some ways, if you talk to young people about where they learn about sexuality, sex education, like the curriculum, is like way down on the list. They learn about it from peers, from their family, from the internet, online communities, so sex education in schools, I feel passionate that this is something is worth fighting for, but I think we overestimate its importance in young people's lives. And we ought to also pay attention to all the other ways people learn about sexuality and gender, across school. And I don't know anyone who says I had a good sex education, and it doesn't matter where they grew up or what kind of school they went to. So most people describe like it's sort of like a ritualistic sharing of horror stories. You'll never believe what I learned, and then out comes the story of the nuns or So I think it's funny to be making a case, to be participating in I think one of the ironies for me about participating in Expert is that I had to somehow rally some feeling that sex education in schools was actually a place where people learned about sexuality and gender. And I'm not sure that is always the case. And certainly with AB, here's a kid who hasn't even reached the lessons that have been withheld from her, but already she has, expressing this incredible agency to advocate on her own behalf. So she learned despite schooling, not because of it, I think.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Any more questions? And may I ask a question, Dr. Gilbert?
Sure. Yeah.
I feel very touched by your speech because I'm not an expert, or in my research area, there's no gender studies, but I feel very touched because you're sharing your personal experience and your idea of uncertainty and messiness involved in this kind of research, and your personal involvement and identifying yourself to the extent that you don't want to identify with any identities you have, like professors or in that court. So you feel very vulnerable. So I think this is very relevant to me as a teacher. So the uncertainty and also the vulnerability involved in teaching in whatever subjects, whatever content. So yeah, this is more like a comment rather than a question. So I think it's very touching. Yeah.
Oh, I appreciate that. it's true. I think I can only do it now, but I think we have this sense that you move through your education, accumulating these credentials and experiences that somehow mean that you don't still feel like a beginner, you know, but somehow if we think of development as recursive and as cumulative rather than linear, you have like vulnerability returns over and over. And to be, I didn't, you know, I talk so often with PhD students about their feelings of being an imposter. And so to be thrown back into a situation where I felt like a PhD student again, or like the PhD student I once was very hard, but I thought there might be lessons there about the structure of expertise around sexuality and gender. And so, yeah, I don't normally write like this, so I appreciate you saying that, because it's not only was it a vulnerable experience, it's also vulnerable to write about.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gilbert, for delivering such a thought-provoking talk. As my colleague from China raised a question related to the dominant culture. So I'm from Pakistan, and here we also have this dominant culture uh, in the shape of patriarchy. Which in schools teaches sexuality as something inherited or something biological, and you cannot do anything about it. And here in schools, we are told, we tell our females, you don't have any choice in it because this is natural, and this way they are marginalized. My concern is that, as you come from somehow a privileged background, I would say, in relation to the people from the third world countries, where these subalterns uh, within the societies like us, they do not speak. And how do you place these people within your own work? How do you look at them? Do they speak? Do they have the ability to speak for themselves, or we as experts somehow or the other have to channelize them in the field of sexuality as curriculum? Thank you.
Well, thanks for that question. I appreciate the pointing to in a sense, the burden and responsibility of speaking for people when one is called to speak as an expert, right? Because you're raised as a singular voice meant to somehow represent a whole range of experiences, so somehow I was called upon to speak for and on behalf of all of these queer and trans young people who, of whom AB was a representative, but would be all of these young people who would be harmed by the removal of this curriculum. And I think when I turned to Avery Gordon at the end of the paper, it's because I take seriously how that responsibility and what it would mean for me to not see myself as somehow above all of those concerns, but to what she calls to make common cause. Yeah, so I'd say that in terms of like how I really think of sex education as both a transnational project and as one that's intimately local, so that the controversies often happen at the level of the school even, never mind the district or the board. But at the same time, if you look around the world, similar conversations are happening across jurisdictions. And so there is this tension, sexuality as intimate, lived really at the level of the body, but then also as the meanings of sexuality as traveling across nations and ignoring borders and so on. So I think that's what I have to say about that. I think that I think that there was something for me that was very poignant about participating in the case, precisely because I was representing or being called upon to act as an advocate for a student so far outside of my own experience. Yeah, I don't know if I have anything else to say about that, but I'm gonna keep thinking about it. So thank you. Anything else?
Thank you, Gilbert. I found it very relevant paper and your research. I'm speaking from Nepal. In our context as well, there was a women's movement for their right, and after that, there is third genders movement. That is the voice, the society or social groups, or communities, or gender perspective. There is a movement, there is a parliamentary representation of the third genders. But here, what we are doing as professionals in the classroom, sometimes I ask the students as well, there are only two genders. One gender, which is known as third gender. They have got even the right and identity in their citizenship as well as third gender. Then in this context, I ask the students, here are only two types of genders. Still there is third gender who haven't come into the classroom. They cannot feel the comfortable in the classroom, in our classroom. These types of discussions I often do in the classroom. But in the curriculum studies, it has been very far to include still yet. However, government has made such type of policies which have included the women or girls, but still there is lacking about the third genders. The third genders, for the third genders, school should be friendly for them. Mm-hmm. But it is nowadays it is said that the school should be friendly for the children. Then again we have to go deeper from that. That is the gender friendly for third genders. It is necessary, but about the curriculum, there is no policies and very few resources are here. However, here are the voices. In this context, it's my question to Gilbert, Dr. Gilbert, how to initiate, how to start to frame or conceptualize the third gender LGBT friendly curriculum. Okay, thank you.
Well, that's a hard question. I don't think I know, but one of the things that I noticed in your introduction to your question, and maybe this goes back also to Gulzar's question, is that across context, people are struggling with the meanings of gender and sexuality in schools. That's, that school is a place where we have conflict around the meanings of what it means to be a boy, what it means to be a girl, even what are the boundaries of heterosexuality? What gender and sexual futures do we plan for young people? And how do young people themselves across context push back against those expectations, refuse those expectations? And I think that this is one of the the reasons why sex education is so interesting to me, even if it's not effective as a place for young people to learn about sexuality and gender. What's interesting is it is a place where young adults and young people come together to talk about what sexuality and gender means in their lives. And I think that we want that conversation to be as open and inclusive as every social and political context allows. And I recognize that social and political context shift from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and some conversations are possible in some jurisdictions and not in others. It doesn't mean, though, that gender and sexual experimentation aren't happening just because those conversations aren't possible in curriculum and policy. So I don't know what the answer is to your question, except to say in wherever we are, I think we want to push for more inclusivity and openness, and to see how much and how big the conversation can get about sexuality and gender in schools, given the political realities of each place, because schooling is a political place. And I understand, as easy as a researcher, because I'm not responsible for writing curriculum, but I understand that those who work in curriculum and policy are working under a set of constraints that limit what they can do, and also make possible other openings. So I appreciate your question, is kind of pointing to the ways in which school is a place where adults and young people come together to talk about what gender and sexuality could look like and should look like. That's the regulation piece.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think, having considered the time, so
Yeah.
I hope to thank Dr. Jan Gilbert again for your wonderful speech and the wonderful conversations we have just had. And I hope to thank Dr. William Piner and Dr. Anne Phelan for hosting this such a thought-provoking event. And I want to thank all of you for participating in today's seminar sessions. And our next session is scheduled on October the 9th, which is next Friday. And so we are looking forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for hanging out with me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for your questions.